All right. So welcome to our Photoshop Skill Builder session. Today we're going to be starting with editing photo quality. And let's talk a little bit about some basics of Photoshop. So some of you mentioned earlier that maybe you used Illustrator or InDesign, or maybe it's been a little while since you've used Photoshop. So I think it's important to go over some of the qualities that Photoshop has that differentiates it from other tools. So Photoshop is what's called pixel-based. And you know what pixels are if you've seen little squares of color on photos. So those little squares are actually the pixels. Photoshop is what's known as a resolution dependent program. So what you create in Photoshop is specific to that size and that resolution. You can't scale it up or down without losing some quality. That's very different than InDesign or Illustrator, which are raster dependent or line based. With Illustrator, if you made a logo, that logo could go on something as small as a business card. It could go on the web. You could wrap it around a bus and you wouldn't have to worry about resolution. You do have to worry about resolution and quality in Photoshop. So I gave you some tips there on resolution. If you're working on the web or screen, usually anything between 72 and 150 works. You get up to 150 and you're not, you've made the file size larger without much improvement. So steering down toward the 72 and saving yourself file size is worth it. If you are printing something, you want at least 300 dots per inch. And when we jump into Photoshop, we're going to look at an example of these resolutions to kind of help you out. So some other things about file types, and these are the two most common types that we're going to be dealing with. First of all is JPEG. You're probably very familiar with JPEGs. It's what your phone shoots, it's what you're emailing, it's what you're posting. JPEGs are a compressed file format. I always like to be conscious of that compressed file format because if I am going to be doing work on JPEGs and then resaving them out as JPEGs multiple times, every time I save, I compress the file. So obviously, if I'm going to go into a print situation, I want to be cautious of how many times I'm compressing. My personal workflow is if I am working for a print situation, I get one chance at a JPEG and then I go to a TIFF. So a TIFF is a layered file format. That means you can keep all of your Photoshop layers, and TIFFs are really good for print. So that's typically what I stay in if I'm doing something for publishing. And then just again, a reminder of colors that you are working with. So CMYK is a print color. That's cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And then RGB is your screen color, red, green, and blue. This is important to note because if you've ever printed out a photo that looked awesome on your phone or awesome on the computer and it looks too dark when you print it, that's because the printer adds black, whereas your screen, whether that be your phone or your computer, adds white. So we're not going to get into like a print correction, but just know that if you do anything at the journalism school where you're going to be printing something, pop by the J-Bar or set up an appointment with me and we can get into detail specifically with your project. So we're going to go through 5 different demonstrations today that are going to give you some basics of this photo correction. We're going to look at how you do a levels correction, a curves adjustment, some additional edits that you can do, not just in Photoshop, but I'm going to introduce you to a couple of other tools I just want to put on your radar. We're going to go through correction tools and probably talk a little bit about ethics when we do corrections. And then we're going to play with some shadow and highlights and some cool tricks you can get to edit files. So like I said, if you just want to take notes during the demo, that would be great. And then you'll have time to practice with these files and answer questions as we get going. So I'm going to do a new share and hop over to Photoshop. All right. So any questions that anyone has so far? Are we doing okay? Okay. If you run into any questions, feel free to interrupt me or to pop those in the chat and we will try to get those answered as well. Okay. So I am in Photoshop right now, and let's just do a little overview of what this Photoshop environment is and how we work with it. So to get started, all of the normal things you do with files are under the File menu. So to open these photos, I went to File, Open, and yours came in a zip file. If you're not familiar with zip files, all you have to do is double click them to unzip them. And then when you go into session 1, you'll see the 5 photos we're working with, and we're just going to work those in order. So you select that photo and hit open. Conversely, if you were going to start like a new document, and we'll do this at a later session, you use File, New. Everything else you see in the File menu is generally what you would normally see. So exports, prints, all of those things. And we'll do a couple of things with that as we go further in our sessions. So the edit menu, the important thing I want to point out here is the transform menus. And we're going to be using that in our second session. So you have your transform menus. Under image, this is a lot of what we talked about with the resolution. So I'm going to go into image size. And you can see for this image, it is an 8:6 at 240. So if I wanted this to be printed, I would first uncheck this resample, change it to 300, and notice that brought the size down. So if I had wanted to run this photo, say full page of a magazine, it's not large enough for me to do that. So that's just a little bit about that resolution. Layers, most of the time when we do layers, we're going to be working with our layers panel over here. So you should be seeing some panels on your right-hand side. If not, I'll show you how to get to those. Type tools, we might do a little bit in type. Typically when I do type, I like to use something like Illustrator or InDesign because it tends to look a lot better. If I'm designing something for a very specific size, I do use type. Selection, we're going to be using a lot of tools for selection as well as the selection menu. Filters, there's a very exciting camera raw filter we're going to be playing with, and later on we're going to look at some of these other filters for kind of some special effects. 3D, there are a lot of really cool things you can do with 3D in Photoshop now. We will probably, that's a pretty advanced function. We probably won't get to that in this session, but definitely if that's an area that interests you, there's a lot of good stuff on Behance on 3D. Any of your views, so if you need to show rulers or show a grid, any of that is available here. Also your shortcuts to zoom in and out, Command plus, minus, and 0 to fit in a window. So under your window, this is where all of your panels live. And so I'm going to switch my workspace because I'm in a workspace that I've set up for myself. So I'm going to click to the essentials, and this should look a lot like what you're seeing right now. If it doesn't, let me know when we can try to get that fixed for you. So this is the essentials panel, and you can start moving all of these panels around. So for example, we're not really going to use this learn panel, so I can drag it out and I can close it. We are going to be using our adjustments and our layers panel. So we're going to keep that out as well. You can always collapse or expand these panels. And you'll notice you have some other little panels here in the middle, and you can kind of expand those out as well. So panels are where all the really good action happens. Over on the left-hand side, you're going to see your toolbar. If you click those three dots at the bottom of the toolbar, let's go, oh, nope. And then hold, you can edit your toolbar. So if there's ever occasion where I'm using a tool and you don't have it, check and see if you need to get back to your default toolbar panel that has everything in it. All right, so give me a thumbs up if you're feeling good about where we are right now. Okay, see thumbs up, thumbs up. Excellent, great. Well, we're gonna go ahead and jump into corrections. Let me see. So first, let's talk about how do you know when you need to correct? Well, chances are, unless you have shot it professionally with a really high grade camera, if you're just out shooting cell phone photos, you probably need some correction. The other thing you want to eyeball is lights, darks, and what I call pop. So this photo, you can see we're losing a lot of detail in the trees. And I'm just not getting a lot of pop. I remember when I took this picture that like this scene was very moving in the water, but I'm not seeing that now. So that's my first indication that I want to start correcting it. Now there's two types of adjustments you can do in Photoshop. One is called legacy adjustments. So if I go up to image, I can do some auto adjustments. So I can throw in an auto tone and an auto contrast. And I can go into my adjustments and let's say I'm going to do a levels. And I can play with this and hit OK. I want to point out, while I might have improved parts of that photo, we're definitely getting some more pop in the sky and in the water. Notice that there's no layers. I have permanently changed these pixels. That is super dangerous. So I'm going to go back to my history panel, and I'm just going to click on the open. The reason that these legacy adjustments are dangerous is because they permanently change your pixels. So if I save this, it would be permanently changed. I couldn't get the original back. Now I could save it out as, I don't know about you, but when I start saving things out as, I end up with like the junkiest folder in the world. So a much better way to correct is to use our adjustments layers. So when I select an adjustment layer, and I'm going to select levels, notice I get an addition to my layers panel. So think of this as putting a layer of adjustment on top of the photo. Couple of rules for our adjustment layers. You only want to add the same adjustment once. So if I do a levels, I don't want to add multiple layers of levels adjustment. To get back to my levels adjustment, all I have to do is click the little icon on that layer and it brings up that properties panel for me to use. This here with these waves, the mountains, that is called a histogram. Think of those as the piles of color in our photo, ranging from black over here to white over here. Our goal is to have pure blacks, pure whites, and everything in between. So when we look at our histogram, what we want to do, and I think a great trick if you're learning, is to be aggressive. So you can see when I slide that over here, you can really see that change in the black. Now a good correction is going to be right about here where I start to slope up. So right about that peak. Same thing on this white level. I can really blow that photo out, but I want it to be right here. And I'm looking at my clouds because I want them to maintain their cloud detail. And then the middle point is our gray. So I can pull that up or down, and I'm going to open that up a little bit. And I might tweak this a little bit. So here's my favorite part of making adjustments. There's our before, and there's our after. And if I want to, I can come back in here and tweak it again to make additional adjustments. So I can add multiple layer adjustments on top of the same photo. So I can click Vibrance, and I'm going to just increase the saturation and increase the vibrance a little bit. So again, here's our before, here's our after. You can see it's adding in some details from the trees. And anytime I want to go back and correct, all I need to do is just double click and get back in there and correct that. There are also presets that I can add. So I'm going to turn off my vibrance layer. I'm going to pop into the presets. So I can just use these as an experiment of what might work best for me. And so you can see how those might adjust differently. And we'll go back to where we were before. And so that's a basic levels adjustment. Next, we're going to look at levels and curves. So again, what am I looking for? I'm looking at areas where I'm losing some detail here in the shadows that I might want to bring out. And I'm looking at, like, when I shot this photo, I remember it felt a lot more colorful. So I'm keeping that in mind too. That gives me an idea that I probably want to either change my levels or my exposure, and also think about curves. So I'm going to pop in, and we're going to start with looking at brightness contrast. So brightness and contrast is one that a lot of people like to pop in and use, and you can see it does lighten up a photo, and it does increase the contrast. I am not a fan of brightness and contrast because you don't get to adjust those gray tones. Now, I do enjoy brightness and contrast when I have line art. So if I've scanned in like a drawing into Photoshop and I'm correcting it, I definitely use brightness and contrast because I'm already talking black and white there. So if I don't want this adjustment, I'm just going to select it in my layers and throw it away. So I'm back to my original photo. All of these corrections here are the tone corrections. And you always want to correct these tone before you start doing color or special corrections. So let's look at exposure. So exposure is just like adding exposure in camera. And this is usually a good place to kind of start when you want to open up some of those colors. So you can see already how we're opening up a lot of the shadows in here without losing too much detail. I'm actually going to revert that back. So I use this little revert button, and I'm going to close that down. I want to show you an alternative to the exposure, and that's using a combination of levels and curves. So I'm going to go into my levels using the same tricks we used before. And you can see, like, remember the last one, the white curve was here, how much more gentle this curve is. This really means I need to bring in quite a bit of white. And I'm going to open up my gray points. And so what I'm looking, I don't want to move these so far that my sky blows out. And I don't want to move my gray so far that I start blowing out this down here. So the feeling I'm getting is I kind of need to adjust here and here, like the dark grays and the light grays. If you feel that way about a photo, that's when you need to apply a curve. So I'm going to add my curves adjustment. And so the only thing you need to know about curves is you always create an S curve. And you start that by clicking in the middle for a set point. And so these are my dark grays down here. These are my light grays up here. So I'm going to experiment. We have a, do you like this or do you like this? Well, obviously this opens those up. Well, if my S's went up right here, it's going to go down over here. And so I've just gently created a little edit in the mid-tone dark and mid-tone light. So that's our before and that's our after. So it's just gently bringing those out. Now to bring out the vibrance, I'm going to open that one up. I'm just going to take both my vibrance and my saturation up. And what I'm looking at is the sky as well as these colors down here. Now this is where the kind of the artistic voice starts coming in. So I am an editor who just believes that every photo deserves a little bit of saturation and brightness. I probably over edit my photos for those bright colors. This is where you start finding your own voice. So if we go back in time, here was our start photo. We added our levels, we added our curves, and then we brought in some vibrance. So now this photo feels a lot more close to what I shot, what I remember shooting. All right, I'm gonna pop back over here. Any concerns or any problems that we're having yet? Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down or, okay, doing good. All right, fabulous. Okay, we're gonna jump in and I'm gonna show you some photo edits beyond Photoshop. So this is gonna be on our other edits, Camera Raw or Lightroom. So like I just mentioned in the last photo, there are certain ways you need to edit. You always want to, in your adjustment panel, kind of do this top row first, your tone, and then start doing your color adjustments. One of the cool things that you can do in Photoshop is use what's called a Camera Raw filter. And it actually lists adjustments in the order you can do it. Now, in order for it not to be like those legacy adjustments, I need to do a little trickeration. So I'm going to go to my layers panel. I'm going to click this lock and I'm going to control click on it, which is the same as a right click, and go to convert to smart object. Once I convert it to smart object, any adjustment that I put on this appears as a layer. So I'm going to go up to my filter and my Camera Raw filter. And all I need to do is be on this right-hand side and adjust in the order that you see it. So this is a photo, and this is my windshield schmutz. I shot this through the window of my car, as we sometimes do. And so what I want to do is bring out these kind of fall colors. These are the trees kind of behind the murk. They're always the first trees to like want to be all fall-like. They're a little extra, I like them. So the first thing I can do is go in and just start adjusting my white balance and think about what I want to do. So the auto had these adjusting cold, but I want to warm these up. So I'm going to just add a little warmth. So add a little yellow and magenta. I'm going to open up the exposure just a little bit. Play with my contrast. I'm going to lower some of my highlights. I'm going to darken some of my shadows. And you can see we've started to bring out a little more of the reds there. And I can go back and keep playing with these. So these are all the same as that top layer inside of Photoshop. These down here are great for if you've ever shot a photo of a landscape And even though it didn't look like there was haze, this will kind of help that bring that out. And again, I'm going to add my vibrance because I love a good vibrance. And so that's my correction. So I'm going to hit OK. And so here's my before, and here's my after. And that camera raw filter is still right there, and I can go in and edit that, bring up camera raw again. So it's much like using the layer adjustments, but we've kind of jumped into a new program. So if you're worried about the order of correction, camera raw is a fun place to start. I'm going to hop over again. This time I'm going to share Adobe Lightroom. So there's two different Lightrooms. There is Lightroom CC and Lightroom Classic. Lightroom Classic exists only on your desktop. I'm showing you Lightroom CC, and the reason why I'm showing you, this is on your phone. So if you were looking for a good tool to edit your photos professionally and also have access to them in the Adobe suite, Adobe Lightroom on your phone is a great one. So similar as before, here's the order we correct. We start with a little exposure. If you're not sure, go back and forth, see what you like. So I'm going to open that exposure up a little bit, increase my contrast, decrease some of those highlights, bring some shadows in, add some color adjustments. So here I'm going to bring in some of that warmer temperature like we did before. There's my vibrance. So even though we've used 3 different programs, the language is the same. You're still adjusting temperature and tint and highlights and shadows and all of that inside the programs. So pointing out again, cool things you can do, little vignettes, get all fancy, bump up the grain, make it look like old-fashioning. So Lightroom, I can then hop this over to Photoshop, or I could just save this photo out. It also has, you know, I like a good before and after. So there's my before, there's my after. That button is just at the bottom of your screen. So the reason why I wanted to show you those tools is that there's more than one answer for editing your photos. And I think having a tool like Lightroom that is mobile, or Camera Raw that helps you correct things in order is a good thing for you guys to think about as you're working. So our next one is going to be corrections. And so this is not my photo. This is a photo I got from Unsplash. So if you are not familiar with either Unsplash or Pixabay, definitely sign up because you get a lot of photos that you can start working with. So this time we're going to move away from our adjustment panel and move into some correction tools. So we're going to be working with, I'm going to start with the clone tool, and then I'm going to go into our healing tools. So the spot healing brush is probably the one on top, and it's just 2 up from that clone stamp. So my clone stamp, and you can see there's my brush size. So that size of that circle is my brush size. And if I use my right bracket on my keyboard, it makes it bigger. And if I use my left bracket, it makes it smaller. So with the clone stamp tool, I set a source. So I'm hovered over this person right here, and I'm going to control click. When I get control click, I've set the copy point. And you can already see what's about to happen. We are about ready to clone this person multiple times in the scene. Now, why am I not cloning them down here? Because my cloning source is always the same direction from where I copied. So if I wanted to copy this person again down here, I would need to, again, Alt select and then move down. Okay? So that's the clone tool. You can use the clone tool to do some type of corrections, but you can see it's a little rough. So as I copied, it's very obvious that you're just copying something. I think clone tool is decent for like large areas of repair, but when you want to go in and do details, the healing tools here are a much better solution. So if you notice, some of your tools have this little white arrow next to it. If you click and hold, that shows you additional tools. So we're going to use this spot healing brush. And I'm going to zoom in. And so I'm just using my Command plus. And then I'm just mousing over because I want to clean up some of the kid schmutz here. So I'm just going to click. And notice how it's removing these areas. The healing brush tool uses Adobe Sensei, which is Adobe's artificial intelligence, to read the area you're clicking on and then smoothing that out using pixel information from around it. So if you end up with an unfortunate zit or wrinkle, the spot healing brush will take care of that for you. Now, this is where I start talking to you about some photo ethics. There is a difference between correcting to improve and correcting to change. And I know you guys know that. So a good rule of thumb, what can you correct and what can't you? The rule that I always live by is if I could do it in a traditional darkroom, I will do it to a photo. Now, you can do some pretty serious photo changes in the darkroom, but I'm talking like beginning darkroom. So adjusting tone, adjusting, color correcting your photos. Those are fine. These type of corrections I'm showing you here, I would not present in a news sense. So for those of you who are on the news side, I would be very cautious of even these type of changes in the newsroom. Especially in the world we live in, I think we're called to a higher order of ethics when it comes to presenting photographic information. It's so easy to change the meaning of the photo while we're correcting images. If I were working for an advertising situation, I would want to make sure that in my house, whoever I'm working for, we have clear signatures, we have clear waivers, we have clear knowledge of anything we're doing to correct and change photos. So you can see how that changed that photo. I'm going to move up here, and now I'm going to do the healing brush tool. So the healing brush tool, and you can see it's already got something there. It works like the clone tool. So I need to pick an area and then use it. And if you see those crosshairs, that's where I'm copying from. And it's combining, if you look at this area, it's combining kind of the old and the new. Whenever you use the healing brush, it blends and you get a little bit of a blur around it. So there are occasions when this works great, but there are occasions like this one where his arm starts looking kind of wacky. So we're going to zoom back out. We're going to zoom into this area now. So our next one, we're going to experiment with, actually, let's do the patch tool down here. Or, excuse me, the healing brush. So I'm going to heal brush these people away. And you can see if instead of brush, if I kind of do it's a click and a brush movement, I can start to cover up things a little bit easier. It takes quite a bit of work. And if I zoomed into this, you could tell that something happened there. Next is my patch tool. So your patch tool replaces from one area to the next. So I'm going to select this. I'm just going to move over here. And you can see and I'll deselect with Command D, it kind of blended and covered up that area. Now, if I were doing this for real, I would want to come into this because I gave myself a little bit of a line there and maybe redo this a little bit so I get a little bit better of a correction there. And so it's blending those two things together. So if you need to move large things out of the content, that is great. The next is content aware move. So I'm going to again select like we did before. And so I'm basically using that same technique we used for the patch tool with a couple of exceptions. One, it's going to blend it to the background, but I also get to transform. So if all of a sudden I want to make her gigantic, I can make her gigantic. And notice it tried to combine some of the sand. And the first character has disappeared. So those are your correction tools. I probably use the spot healing brush the most. Red eye tool, exactly like it sounds, you could mouse over the eye area and clean up red eye. So our final example today is, I think, one of the more common problems I see in photos, which is shadows and highlights. And so if I wanted to come in here and start adjusting, you can see that I'm still not getting great detail back here. That certainly helped, but I've almost kind of blown out a lot of these other areas to get this opened up. So I'm going to show you a cool trick with shadows and highlights. So if you look in your adjustments panel, looky there, there's a shadow and highlight, but it's a legacy adjustment. Similar to how we did the camera raw filter, if I unlock this photo, right click on it, convert it to a smart object, and there's that little icon that says smart object, I can now add that shadows and highlights so I'm just adjusting some of the tone on this. And you can see how it can bring down those highlights so they don't feel as blown out. But I'm getting pretty good detail back there. Just gonna tweak that a little bit. And so I'm playing with the amount, I'm playing with the tone. By default, you only get the shadow and highlight. I always go into show more options so I can fully adjust my shadows and highlights. So hit OK. So there's my before, there's my after. I would probably now want to come in and play again with my levels just to make some of those areas pop a little bit more. And so there's my before and there's my after. And I've opened up so that I can see what's going on back in this back area, but I haven't blown these areas out. And I might, if I was continuing to play, I'd probably play a little bit more to bring out more detail here. So that is a trick for shadows and highlights. Your project brief for next week is to find 2 to 3 photos that you've taken that need correction. Apply any of the skills we've learned. Think about how you might use the adjustment layers creatively rather than correctively. So that would be playing on that second or third row of the adjustment layers. And then we'll have time, instead of introductions, we'll start next week with an optional share, and it's always optional. Your recap video is going to go right into this space, so look for that. And so here, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Joyner Lucas, me getting things messed up, album cover, but it's a play on that album cover. So let me show you, and I offer no recommendations musically, but I just think this is like the coolest album cover recently. I was just very inspired by it. So we're going to do a play on that. So I am going to be using a couple of photos from Unsplash that I found for that, and we'll go through that demo, and then try the same thing with your own photo next week. So that's where we are headed.